And special thank you to Francisco for teaching us so patiently over and over again. This morning, our youth fellows are in charge, so I just wanted to be brief here, but I can't help but tell you about our speaker this morning. As you know, this fall, our youth fellows have been inviting speakers on a variety of topics that are very important to them. We had a meeting early on where they kind of brainstormed the kinds of things they were interested in learning about. And then we did a little kind of ranked choice voting survey about what they would prefer to focus on. And reproductive justice was at the top of the list for our young people. Now, this is not an uncomplicated issue to talk about in a church, right? And so we wanted to be very intentional about who we brought in to speak on this topic. And I just so happened to know someone who was a faith leader and an advocate for reproductive justice. Reverend Katey Zeh is an ordained Baptist minister and the chief executive officer of the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. We have been having very local groups come to meet with us. This is a national group. They do have local arms, and Reverend Katey will tell us about that later. But if you can get the CEO, right, like you get them. Katey and I have known each other for a long time, since we were young women in our 20s, like advocating at the United Nations somehow. I don't know how it happened. And so I reached out to her. She was super excited, especially about meeting with our youth today. So thank you so much, Reverend Katey, for being with us. Just to tell you a little bit more about her, the Center for American Progress named her one of the top justice-seeking faith leaders to watch. Hello. And she's a member of the Clergy Advocacy Board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She has written for many outlets, including the Washington Post, Sojourners, Religion News Service, and she's been featured in a lot of outlets, The Atlantic, CNN, The Nation, BBC, NBC News, Newsweek. She is the co-host of a monthly podcast called Kindreds, and she's the author of 2 books, her latest of which is A Complicated Choice, Making Space for Grief and Healing in the Pro-Choice Movement. There's a lot more that we could say. Reverend Katey is a lot of things, a well-rounded person, but here she is this morning to talk to us about reproductive justice. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it to you, friend.
Hi, good morning. This is a first for me, not Zoom preaching, but Zoom preaching to folks who are gathered together in person. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm so honored to be with all of you this morning this way. Thank you to technology. And also really looking forward to speaking with young people. I got started in this work when I was a young person myself. I guess I'm not as young as I used to be. So I always love talking to young people who are interested in this issue, especially as an issue of faith. And so before I get into my message, I want to read this morning from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. This is probably a story that many of you have heard many, many times, and I hope that the divine will give us new ears and open hearts to hear it in a different way this morning. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The word of the Lord. As an openly pro-choice Baptist minister, I get this question a lot. Where in the Bible do you find support for the work you do, for abortion rights and for reproductive justice? Most people assume that the Bible is somehow anti-abortion, but contrary to what you might have heard, abortion is actually never mentioned in the Bible. And there are very few biblical texts that remotely address fetal life or even pregnancy. But here are two of them. In the book of Exodus, there's a scenario in which a pregnant woman is injured in battle. And if she miscarries as a result of this, the perpetrator is required to pay a fine, not to the pregnant woman, of course, but to her husband. But if the woman's body is severely injured, or if she dies as a result, the cost, the text says, is life for life. Here we have a biblical example of a clear distinction being made between the loss of a pregnant person's life and the loss of a pregnancy. Additionally, in the book of Numbers, we have a passage in which a priest gives a woman who has been accused by her husband of adultery a bitter drink that he curses, and that is meant to be a kind of purity test. The text is a little bit vague about what happens as a result of imbibing this, but many have suggested that the drink is actually an abortifacient because it can cause swelling of the belly. And it also says that if the woman is innocent of adultery, she will go on to conceive children. So needless to say, both of these passages fail to provide the kind of clarity that we desire around an issue as complex and nuanced as abortion. What we do have, though, are other biblical texts that speak to the larger issues of reproductive justice, a framework developed by Indigenous and Black women in the 1990s that is much broader than the right to an abortion. It's the right to bodily autonomy. It's the right not to have children. It's the right to have children. And it's the right to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. In the Bible, we have stories of reproductive oppression and coercion. I think of stories like Hagar in the book of Genesis, who is a forced surrogate for Abraham and Sarah. And we also have stories of resistance, like the Hebrew midwives of Exodus 1, who refused to comply with the unjust laws of the Egyptian Pharaoh and who used their knowledge of childbirth to protect the dignity of the Hebrew women who are giving birth and the lives of their infant sons. And in today's gospel reading, we have an example of what reproductive healing can look like, not only for one person, but for an entire community. The story of the hemorrhaging woman in Mark is for me the cornerstone passage that inspires me. Every time I read it, it brings me to tears. And it keeps me grounded in the kind of healing ministry that Jesus lived into. It was expansive and embracing and evolving. This woman has been suffering from hemorrhaging for 12 years. This constant bleeding has destroyed her physically, and presumably it's destroyed her fertility too. And in searching for a cure, she spends all the money that she has on doctors who don't make her well. They make her worse. And this alone is a tragedy. But beyond her physical suffering, which is immense, the stigma associated with this health crisis leaves her socially isolated too. The rules and norms of that society would have dictated where a bleeding woman was permitted to go and what kind of relationships she was allowed to have. So for over a decade, her suffering has been a source of great oppression. It has defined the boundaries of her life and her identity. Even the writer of the gospel refers to her by condition and not by name. When she learns that a healer named Jesus will be coming through her community, she realizes that this may be her last chance to save her own life. It's time for her to abandon the rules that have failed her, to stop asking for permission to be healed, and to take, through risking, what she needs to be made well. She says, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. And she's very strategic in how she approaches Jesus because she's really not supposed to be there. So when he passes her in the crowd, I imagine she's low to the ground, trying to stay out of sight, and just reaches out very tenderly. Her fingers are just barely grazing the bottom hem of his garment. She's trying to do it in the most inconspicuous way possible. And what she feels in her body is that she is healed instantly. And I never thought about this until I was preparing for this morning, but just what amazing kind of body awareness she has to know this right away. I think that is absolutely amazing. And it's in that instant of her reaching out in faith and bravery that the healing is catalyzed, not consciously by Jesus, who is seemingly completely unaware of this happening. It's her reaching out. It's her audaciousness to reach out for the thing that she knows that she needs, that she doesn't have permission to take, but that she knows in her heart intuitively is what will bring her the healing that she so longs for. And that's only the beginning of her healing. What I love about this story is that Jesus is not the protagonist. The woman is. It's through her touch that the healing power is unleashed. And it stops Jesus in his tracks. He asks the crowd, "Who touched me?" Not in an angry way or an accusatory way, but a deeply curious way. He has to know what just happened. Who touched me? And of course, the disciples, in their typical way, state the obvious, which is, everyone's touching you, Jesus. But there was something so distinctive about this woman's touch, where Jesus actually is moved physically and needs to know what happened. Who touched me? For me, this moment is when the woman chooses bravery again, because she could have easily left the crowd unnoticed and gone about her life having been healed. But she feels drawn to the possibility of something even more miraculous for her. Liberation. Liberation. Despite her fear, this cured woman chooses to tell Jesus, as the story says, the whole truth. And I imagine that her telling her story and recounting the details of her suffering is really gut-wrenching for her. But as she breaks the silence of her years of isolation and gives voice to her pain, she finds full and complete healing. And I imagine so do the people gathered there in the crowd. This woman's display of courage to proclaim her truth, both her pain and her healing, in front of Jesus is way more than a personal healing story. Because Jesus is not the only one who hears her speak. And the crowd surrounding this healer and the healed one are people who have shunned this woman, the ones who have been complicit in her oppression. And there are the ones who suffer similarly, who also feel outcast. And I wonder, what kind of impact does this story have on them as they hear it? And how might her truth-telling serve as a catalyst for collective change in the crowd and in that community? After hearing her story, Jesus responds with so much compassion and kindness and affirmation. He doesn't ask her what caused her bleeding to begin with. He doesn't blame her for it or shame her for it. In front of everybody, he calls her daughter and says, her faith has made her well. Her faith to go against the cultural rules and norms that kept her sick and oppressed. Her faith to seek her own healing without asking for permission. Her faith to overcome her fear and to share her story. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says to his disciples that the truth will set you free. And my experience has been that truth-telling frees all of us. But it takes a lot of faith and a lot of strength and a lot of bravery. Embracing that inner knowing requires us first to shed the stories that others have given to us that have silenced us and shamed us from speaking up and speaking out. Like those unhelpful doctors who took advantage of the hemorrhaging woman's vulnerability, lots of people can be far too eager to offer help that actually hurts us. People who draw uninformed conclusions and take it upon themselves to define what's right and wrong for everybody else without understanding or acknowledging our personal circumstances. They insist on a truth that they claim is absolute and offer simple answers to life's complicated questions. And they wield these tools of oppression that are disguised in the language of love and helpfulness. And whether their intentions are to harm or to heal, they push us deeper into isolation instead of toward liberation. Thankfully, this gospel story offers us a different path to claim our inner knowing that resides in the quiet stillness of our hearts. This account of a woman's healing of her body and her mind and her spirit is a testament to the truth that we know exactly what we need. We have the power to be the catalyst for our own healing and flourishing. Though others might sway us to make different choices, the divine voice of God is always there within us, whispering words of truth and nudging us toward the best path for our circumstances and reminding us that we're never alone. If we can tune out voices that condemn and judge and make false promises of healing, which is sometimes our own inner critic, we can begin to recognize the sound of sacred wisdom that speaks to us with love and truth. One of the things that I hear all the time from people in the wake of the overturn of Roe versus Wade this summer is this idea that we are going backwards or moving back in time. The truth is that this is how we are collectively choosing to move into our future. So is there another way? Is there another option? Is this the future we want to create, or do we want to imagine something different? In the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, the prophet models for us a kind of brilliant theological imagination. He speaks to a traumatized people who have endured invasion and destruction and enslavement, and he tells them boldly about these glorious new heavens and new earth that God is creating, where they will be the center of divine rejoicing and delight and blessing and live in peace and experience abundance for generations to come. Something so far from their current reality. And this practice of holding firmly and boldly to theological imagination can inspire us to cast a vision of the kind of reality that we have not yet seen, yet we believe and we know is possible with the divine. I really believe that hope is a discipline, and it's one that we practice in community. Because what we can't hold individually all of the time, we can and must hold collectively. Together, we can dream our wildest out there visions for the world that we crave, and we can believe against all odds and logic that it is possible to create and sustain something that we have not yet experienced. A beautiful, peaceful reality in which every person has what they need to flourish and thrive, which is honestly at the very core of what reproductive justice is all about. One of the questions I've been asking myself and others in this moment of extreme crisis around abortion access and so much else is, how do we envision a different way forward in our struggle for reproductive justice? How might we challenge some of the assumptions and ways of thinking about our reproductive lives so that we truly can experience liberation in our bodies and have flourishing as a whole? What would it mean, for example, to reclaim our ability to make reproductive decisions as more than a legal right that can be given or taken away, and as something divinely given that can never be taken from us? What would it mean to glean from the women healers and the midwives in ancient times and today who have always ensured that their communities are cared for? What would it mean to revisit the idea that an abortion is a healthcare decision made between a pregnant person and their doctor, and to reclaim abortion as a sacred decision that only a pregnant person has the authority to make? This is the opportunity of this moment to ask these kinds of questions. And for us to take that opportunity, we have to start with the work, the hard work of deconstructing and examining everything that we thought we knew and were taught to believe about our reproductive journeys. When people ask me, what can we do right now for abortion justice? How do we make sure that everybody who needs care can get it? What I say is, I urge you to begin by asking that question within yourself. What might you need to challenge within yourself about the ways that you view people who need abortion care? What might stand in the way? What judgments, what assumptions might stand in the way of you showing the kind of compassion that we all long to embody as followers of Christ? And start asking that question within your community right here. Who are the people who aren't here this morning who might benefit from a thoughtful, nuanced conversation about abortion? What about within your family and your friends and your neighbors? I really urge you to start there, because that is the essential work for the healing and transformation that we will need in the long term to do this work of justice. This is not something that we're going to change right now. We need to be thinking about the long term, holding that long-term vision. And I know this isn't easy to do. Trust me, I know. And that's why I think the hemorrhaging woman is such an important model for us, that when we are brave enough to reach out in spite of our fears, to tell our whole truths, the good, the bad, the ugly, we begin to heal. And that healing is what will help set all of us free. May it be so. Amen.